Sunday. And we had 7 really astounding faith statements. I think we have some preachers in the making in this church. So it was a great day. So welcome to First Congregational Branford. I'm the interim minister here, Reverend Suzanne Personette. And I think we'll have just a great event today. Thank you so much for coming out, for the professor and the preacher. Dave Colley will introduce our guest speakers in a moment. Just want to say at the end of our event, we'll have a very nice little snacks and coffee and beverage for you. So enjoy. Thanks for being here.
Puritans and Puritan philosophy founded this church and coterminously with the town. And the philosophy of Puritanism is H.L. Mencken, social critic, newspaperman, satirist, general curmudgeon, and Chronicle of the Times said in the 20th century, described Puritanism as joyless religious mania, being the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy. Very brief background on our participants. Professor Very Stout, baccalaureate from Calvin College, I actually know where that is, and sustained himself 2 years at Princeton Theological Seminary, continued with an MA and a PhD from Kent State University in Canada, which, by the way, is one of the larger universities, for those of you who have never visited flyover country, in Ohio. Reverend Wayne Jacobson is both an author and previously a longtime minister in our neighboring village of Stony Creek at the Church of Christ Congregational. Wayne attended Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Oh no, don't put me there! Never was there.
I know that, but I promise. Wayne has been the driving force for making the annual spectacular live animal Christmas pageant happen in Stony Creek.
Use the mic.
This included procuring farm animals for the live nativity scenes. I'm told Wayne used to go to livestock auctions to procure animals and convince people that they should lend their llamas, donkeys, goats, time and effort to making the pageant special, which it certainly has been for many years. Incidentally, Wayne has previously been president of the Branford Clergy Association and is currently an active deacon for this church. Thank you. Gentlemen, play away.
Thank you. I'm not sure how organized we're going to be, but I'm going to open it up with a quote that many of you, if you belong to this church, have seen many, many times over. There's a great big 3x3 bronze plaque in the back of the church. It's actually 2 of them, but one of them is dedicated to Philemon Robbins, who was what was considered a new light, and Skip will explain the awakening and what new lights and old lights were. There are 2 phrases on this plaque in the back that kind of stand out with what we'll be discussing today. One of them says he was strenuous in defense of ministerial liberty, and the other one says he was earnest in promoting the great revival. These 2 phrases are great understatements as to who this man was. Earnest in promoting the great revival, strenuous in defense of ministerial liberty. Skip, let's get going.
You want me to hold it? Can you hear me?
No. This hall has very bad acoustics.
All right. In that case, I'll use it.
Yes.
Well, welcome. Happy 375th birthday. It's a pleasure for me to be here, to see so many of you. I'm so glad that the weather cooperated. I'm sure a beautiful sunny day would cut those numbers in half. So thank you all for coming out, and Wade and I are looking forward to a fun time. I don't have a formal lecture to give. I want to say something about the Great Awakening, and then I think that Wayne will follow up. And following that, we want to open it up to questions, and we'll be happy to answer them, right, Wayne?
Yeah, I'm going to question you some.
Okay, Wayne's going to question me.
Open it up to you.
Yeah, my wife Debbie's here. She's probably going to question me. Let me begin with a simple question. Who among you besides pastors and my wife Debbie know what the Great Awakening was? Yes, sir. What was it?
It was a revival of religious fervor. I guess after the original people had come, they were very fervent, but then as the generations went on, they got a little more subdued, and this was an awakening of the spirit. Don't break me.
That's it. I mean, you hit it on the head. I was not referring to the breakfast special at Friendly's, otherwise known as the Great Awakening, but I'm talking about the real Great Awakening that took place roughly between 1740 and 1745, when a series of revivals broke out, not only through the American colonies, but internationally as well. And collectively, all of these revivals were deemed important enough and significant enough to constitute what was a little later called the Great Awakening. Later historians will quibble about that. We're not going to pay any attention to them. And I will just talk about the Great Awakening. It drew unprecedented, the catalyst for the Great Awakening was whom? Jonathan Edwards, I know well. I'm the general editor of the works of Jonathan Edwards, but he wasn't the catalyst. He was kind of the master theoretician. He defended these revivals brilliantly, but he was not the catalyst that promoted them. Who am I thinking of? Whitefield, George Whitefield, spelled Whitefield. He was incongruously an Anglican priest. And Anglican priests weren't really popular with Puritans in New England, but he didn't talk like an Anglican. And he didn't talk like an Episcopalian. He talked like Jonathan Edwards. And, but with a very loud voice and great presentation that would attract literally thousands of people. It was said of him that grown women would swoon to hear him say Mesopotamia. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they said. These audiences had no precedent in early American history. They had no precedent really in British history or in Scotland. He would literally draw huge crowds, and I'll tell you about one of the witnesses to these in just a minute. What was the secret to his success? I spent a number of years looking at his work, his sermons, his journals, his autobiography, and accounts of his ministry in the local press, both secular and religious. And I wrote a biography. And the title of the biography gives the clue to what I think was the secret to his success. I titled it The Divine Dramatist. Because I do think that in contrast to virtually every other minister at this point in history, the theater, not the university lectern, provides the most important clue to why he could succeed in attracting such unprecedented audiences. He grew up in an inn in England. His mother basically ran the household. At a relatively early age, he discovered that he had a knack for plays. He consumed them by the score, and then he began acting to entertain the guests at the inn. And he excelled in both male and female roles. This was not uncommon in the 18th century for males to play both genders in drama. And he enjoyed considerable success. Part of the fruits of that success led to a fellowship for him to attend Oxford University, where he was what was called a servitor, which meant a servant to the aristocrats among the students in the population. And this was the way he supported himself. Early on in his time in Oxford, he became attached to a group of wildly enthusiastic Protestants led by John and Charles Wesley, who go on to form the Methodist Church. Is that a Methodist church, by the way, over there?
No.
It's Baptist. Okay. Well, there's got to be a Methodist church.
Not separate.
No. He fell in with them and became converted to Methodism. And with that conversion, he turned on the theater, talked about it as the devil's workshop, refused to have anything to do with theater, but he took all the secrets of the stage with him. And instead of employing those secrets on the stage, he employed it in his preaching. And developed this dramatic style of preaching where friends and foes flocked in numbers. They could do anything except stay away. And his delivery was very much like the actor. And this was at a time when the main model for preaching was really the university lectern, kind of what I'm doing right here. There would be an elevated pulpit, there would be a minister. The secret to success in theater is not reasoned discourse. It's body language. It's the presentation of self. It was said of the great 18th century stage actor, David Garrett, that he could entertain audiences at dinner parties by instantly changing his facial and bodily expressions to communicate all different moods and all different emotions: love, hatred, envy, lust, desire, anger, rage. And he could go boom, 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 and capture them exactly, where you just had to look at his face and hear his voice, and you knew the emotion that was being driven. And that's what theater thrives on. It's emotion more than reason and rational discourse. Some of you, I'm sure, maybe many of you go to operas. Do you, Charlie? My neighbor, Charlie Posadeni's here. I know he's a friend of opera. Well, if you ever look at the plot of opera, it's absolutely inane. It's immature, it's childish, and yet delivered on stage in a strong opera performance, it would make even the most hardened intellectual cry. And that's kind of the power of the body and human performance in engaging audiences. The size of the audience was confirmed by his best American friend. His best American friend was not his co-religionist Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was very stern. When he preached, it said he would stare at the bell rope for the bell until he cut it in half with his eyes. He was not especially histrionic. He was very much the philosopher in the pulpit. And to be accurate, he and Edwards and Whitefield were allies, but never really good friends. Ironically, Whitefield's best American friend, and this will surprise you, was Benjamin Franklin. They had nothing in common spiritually. Whitefield constantly tried to convert Franklin, and Franklin wasn't buying it. But what Franklin did do was to publish all of Whitefield's sermons, his autobiography, his journals, and he made a fortune doing it. He had a number of interesting anecdotes. He loved to go listen to Whitefield because he was such a performer. So like everyone else, Franklin couldn't stay away, even though he wasn't buying the message that was being delivered. He had a lot of skepticism at first. There were early reports that Whitefield's voice was so powerful that he could rival Roman centurions and generals and reach thousands with his voice. I try to reach this group and you tell me I have to use them. And Franklin didn't believe it. So when Whitefield was preaching one day in Philadelphia, in classic Franklin fashion, he started backing up and backing up. How far back could he go and still hear Whitefield preach? And he wound up all the way down the banks of the Delaware River. And then in classic Franklin fashion, he computed how much space a human being would take up. And then he computed how much space there was from the place where Whitefield was preaching to the river, where he could still hear him. And he came to the conclusion that Whitefield could indeed reach thousands without amplification, without a microphone, through the sheer power of his voice, a technique that he had picked up from his experience with the theater. Whitefield was also a canny exploiter of media. He had his own advance man, so he would travel from town to town to town, and word would spread in advance that Whitefield is coming, Whitefield is coming. And crowds would materialize out of nowhere on the word of this early publicist. Things like this weren't common in churches. This didn't happen in Branford.
He came here twice.
He came here twice, and I'm sure he turned the place upside down.
I think he did.
But you didn't typically find the kind of press that he developed. I'll read you an account of a farmer in Middletown, Connecticut named Nathan Cole, who writes his response upon hearing the news that Whitefield was going to speak or preach in Middletown. And the journal entry, there's a lot of going on that I won't bother reading. But he says, then all of a sudden, in the morning about 8 or 9 o'clock, there came a messenger and said, Mr. Whitefield preached at Hartford, and so it was to preach at Middletown this morning. And then he described running to get his wife, grabbing the horse out of the stable. They're both riding on the horse. Eventually, the horse gets tired of carrying him. So he gets off the horse and runs alongside the horse while his wife stayed in the saddle, all the while fearing that he was going to miss Whitefield. Where's your acting pastor? I'm not sure if this is what greets you when you preach, but it certainly isn't my experience, and it wasn't anybody else's experience either. And then he describes coming to the place in Middletown where Whitefield was going to preach. By the way, he's always preaching outdoors. There's no church that can contain the audiences that he draws. And so Cole notes, and I'm now reading from his journal. And when we came within about half a mile or a mile of the road that comes down from Hartford, Wethersfield, and Stepney to Middletown, on high land I saw before me a cloud or fog rising. I first thought it came from the great river, the Connecticut River. But as I came nearer the road, I heard a noise, something like a low, rumbling thunder, and presently found it was the noise of horses' feet coming down the road. And this cloud was a cloud of dust made by the horses' feet. It arose some rods into the air over the tops of hills and trees, and when I came within about 20 rods of the road, I could see men and horses slipping along in the cloud like shadows. And as I drew nearer, it seemed like a steady stream of horses and their riders, scarcely a horse more than his length behind another, and all of a lather and foam with sweat, their breath rolling out of their nostrils every jump. Every horse seemed to go with all his might to carry his rider to hear news from heaven for the saving of souls. It made me tremble to see the sight, how the world was in a struggle. And then he goes on to describe what Whitefield talked about. Now, to appreciate what's going on back here in 1740 when Whitefield comes to Middletown, you have to do something that I tell all of my students they have to do if they want to be real historians. And that's not memorize facts. That's why I hated history. Never liked it in high school where I had to memorize chronology. The secret to history is the imagination. You have to imagine what it was like to be in Middletown, to imagine what it was like to be Nathan Cole in this audience. Everything was novel. Everything was unprecedented. There were he struggled to find words, men and horses slipping along in a cloud, nostrils flaring, everyone going with all their might to hear words of the salvation of the soul. These are not words that you see in responses to Jonathan Edwards or Cotton Mather or any Puritan preacher that was involved from 1630 on. It was unprecedented, and that's what he was struggling to communicate. This is something new that is driving him. For context, it might be helpful to contrast what I just read about Whitefield out in the open air in Middletown with what typically would go on in a colonial meeting house, not unlike this meeting house in the 18th century. Picture the inside of a meeting house sanctuary. Before you all arrived, I took a glance at the sanctuary. It's a beautiful sanctuary and organ, and it's so nicely structured. You have all of these rows neatly aligned, one after another. You have an elevated pulpit. You have a minister with robes. The pews, if you were in the colonial period, would be seated, which means that you were assigned a place among these pews. Where you were assigned depended on your social status and your wealth. So, Dan, you would have been the elite of the elite in the front row. I won't say who the people in the back row would be, but it was all very structured and very orderly and very tame in many ways. Some things never change. Services tend to be that way. That's what they're supposed to do. Not with Whitefield, though. Sermons were as often as not written out. Did Philemon write out his sermons?
No.
Okay.
Almost never.
Okay. Well, that's what made him a Newlite.
There's one recorded one.
Okay. See, that's why he was a Newlite, because they started imitating Whitefield and didn't want to use notes. Remember my parallel to acting. You never see an actor walking on the stage reading his lines and moving along. There's the appearance, anyway, of spontaneity. You know what I did? I'm going to have to be extemporaneous like Whitefield. I forgot to bring a page with me. Oh well. The whole setting of a Whitefield revival was very different from what went on in virtually every service before that. He would select texts not for their doctrinal significance. Ministers in the 18th and 17th century were crazy about doctrines. So one of their favorite books would be Paul's Epistle to the Romans, which was filled with doctrine upon doctrine upon doctrine that they would explicate for long periods of time. It wasn't uncommon for a colonial minister in a congregation like this to bring an hourglass into the pulpit and let it run down. And if he was on a roll, he might even flip that hourglass over and go for another hour. would last 50 minutes, and they would be very analytically organized in a Calvinistic way. Puritans were largely Calvinist in their theology.
And 2 a day, and it was required to go. If you didn't, you got thrown in jail.
Well, you'd get fined, yeah. Attendance wasn't optional, but you had to go, and quite often there would be one more service in the middle of the week. Whitefield didn't do this with his preaching. As you can imagine, what kind of texts would you look for if what you're specializing in was drama and the stage and theater and passions and emotions? You're going to look for narratives in the Bible that you can recreate and that you can make live and develop them as stories. And Whitefield was a compelling storyteller. One of his most famous sermons was Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. Classic text in the Hebrew Bible. And Whitefield would get into the role. And he would be Abraham, and he would be Isaac, and they're walking up this mountain, and Isaac is saying, "Where are we going, Dad?" And he said, "It's going to be revealed to you. You're going to find out." And then they get to the mountain, to the top of the mountain, and they're on the altar. And Abraham lashes him down onto the altar and prepares to sacrifice him because this is what God commanded of him. And Whitefield would be telling this story, and by this point there would be tears in the audience. Elizabeth, give us some tears. They'd be crying, and the knife would be raised about to strike Isaac, and at the last second, God intervenes and he says, "Well done, Abraham," and spares the child, who goes on to be a patriarch and a prophet, and lives to tell about it. And then Whitefield would come to the punchline. And he'd say, "Now I'm going to tell you about a knife that wasn't withheld." And he would move to the crucifixion and talk about it was through the blood of the crucifixion that your sins are forgiven, and if you take faith in this and believe in this, you too will be saved. Well, I just wanted to give you a sense of the flavor of what this guy was like in the pulpit. I'm not taking any calls. The places that he picked had no sacred significance. They were open fields, they were orchards. Again, largely because no sanctuary could hold him. He did preach one to the largest sanctuary in Boston, and the balcony crashed. And one of the congregants actually died, and he said, basically, "That's it. From now on, I'm going outside." I understand that your balcony had to get a railing. This wasn't part of the original design. I don't know, maybe somebody read about Whitefield's experience and decided we better put a railing up here.
No, some kid fell off of it, and then they put the railing up.
I'm not surprised. They should have done it earlier. And then, how are we doing for time?
We're fine.
We're fine, okay. And then the content of his sermons also differed. In the past, there was a rhetorical formula that ministers routinely used, especially on occasional days of fasting and Thanksgiving. And that formula is often called the Jeremiad, named for the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, who talks to the children of Israel while they're in the Babylonian captivity. And you might expect he'd be saying, "Oh, this is awful, you got nailed here, what a terrible fate that you had." That's not what Jeremiah says. He says, "You know why you're here? Because you deserve it. Because you broke the covenant. You wandered from the covenant and from God, and so this is the punishment that you're being given." And then, really critical. Well, that's kind of what these Puritan ministers were doing. They were preaching Jeremiahs to the people, as a way of, in part, of maintaining the people's loyalty to them. You know what? Want to know why we had a drought? We had a drought because of your sins, because of your backsliding and moving away from the covenant. Well, Whitefield and followers that Wayne will tell you about in just a minute inverted that formula. Whitefield encouraged a lot of native imitators, and what these imitators would do would be to take the form of the Jeremiah, but turn it on its head. And they would say, in effect, you want to know why there's problems in paradise? The problem is your minister. The problem is that your minister has never been converted. Your ministers are whitened sepulchres, wolves in sheep's clothing. So you can imagine what this does to a congregation who for 3 generations heard that they were the problem. And now they're discovering, no, the problem's not us. The problem is we have unconverted ministers who aren't feeling the gospel, who aren't preaching with emotion and passion and engagement. That's why things are bad. Well,
Dead ministers make dead churches.
yes. And this understandably did not go over well with the ministers. But it was candy to a lot of the followers who were chafing at the bit, being told that all of the problems could be laid at their footstool. And so let me just close right now by noting making two observations about the point of this story that I told you. The first point that I would make is, and I do this at great length in my lectures, you'll be spared that the Great Awakening in the history of Protestant Christianity in America and in the British Isles represents the transition from Puritan to what we today would call evangelical. You've heard a lot about evangelicalism. Don't tell me what you heard. I've heard it before. I won't disagree. But it's a dominant popular piety in American culture today. Whitefield and his imitators really represent the face of this new, emerging, more emotional, more pietistic style that is going to dominate the likes of Billy Graham, Billy Sunday, Amy Semple McPherson, today's televangelists, the mega churches. These are all people coming in the aftermath of the Great Awakening. Theologically, there's a lot of overlap between what the Puritans believed and the evangelicals. But culturally and socially, politically even, there's a vast chasm between the two. The future is going to belong to the evangelicals. Wayne asked if I was going to talk about the decline of the Puritans. I'm not going to talk about the decline of the Puritans, although decline they did. You don't find many people today who say, well, you know, I'm a Puritan. H.L. Mencken did a pretty good job of making sure nobody wanted to say they were Puritan by the time he got done with them. And the second takeaway that I have for you from the Great Awakening is that it marks the transition from an old world aristocratic order that prevailed in the churches. Think about the elevated pulpit, the authority, I speak, you listen. Think about the seating according to social rank, everything in its order. It's very old world, very aristocratic. The Great Awakening symbolized new conceptions of religious leadership and popular authority. Increasingly common people, that's all of you, most of you, well, except for Dan in the front row, your privileged seat. Increasingly common people sought charismatic personalities to guide, comfort, and speak for them. The itinerants were the first public speakers. Whitefield and his native imitators, who I think Wayne is going to talk about. They're the first public figures whose influence depends not on formal office or state support, but on their ability to move the people. Persuasiveness rather than superior breeding or learning becomes the measure of success. So too, the Great Awakening symbolized new conceptions of authority, unpopular authority. Ordinary folk knew what they liked and brooked no opposition from their betters. That transformation, as profound as it was far-reaching, did not manifest itself fully until another generation had passed, but when it did, Americans would call it the War for Independence. So in some ways, we can think about the Great Awakening as the first phase of the American Revolution and the cult of popularity, which will continue to grow in America until it will get to the point that a reality TV show host can become president of the United States. Thank you. And with that, I turn the mic over to Wayne.
Okay, thank you. I don't know where to start, especially now, but I do want to describe Philemon Robbins in some detail here. I do want to mention how some of these followers of Whitefield were kind of crazy, kind of like really crazy, very, very crazy. Let's see, I get Tennant and Gilbert.
I'll get this out of your way.
I get him a little bit confused. And I just want to make sure I get the right one. Okay. Gilbert Tennant was a Presbyterian minister in Philadelphia. In terms of what you brought up, of really getting the ministers of New England mad and angry and crazy, he preached a sermon on the dangers of an unconverted ministry. He called the ministers Pharisees, we have got dead churches because we have dead ministers. Did this go off?
Yeah. Dead mice.
Yes?
It went off.
We've got dead mics.
I'm going to talk like Whitfield.
I think you must have turned it off.
Margot, if we can get it going, fine. He called them the people sheep without a shepherd, not born of God. He was disbarred from the ministry in Philadelphia, so he went to New York and created a competing presbytery among the Presbyterians there. We're on? Yes, we're on. He was very controversial and crazy. Whitefield was not as crazy as he was. Now there was also a James Davenport, who was a Congregationalist, and he became a traveling evangelist, much like Whitefield did. And he came here to Branford, at least once, wolves in sheep's clothing. He had book burnings and also had people bring their clothing, and anything that was considered a luxury was also thrown into the fire. And he could tell just by looking at someone if they were converted or not. He could tell just by looking. He was condemned by the Connecticut General Court as mentally unhinged. And he had a clothing burning in London where he stripped his own clothes off of himself, threw it in the fire, and he was reproved by some old lady for being naked. Arrested. Yes, he was arrested, right. But he was considered of ill repute because of his extravagances. When he came here to Branford, he walked down the street and he was singing crazily, just as loud as he could. And Philemon Robbins could see that something was very wrong, so he disinvited him to speak. Now, Robbins, that's the guy that's got the plaque in the back. you didn't really go into new lights and old lights.
No,
I will in 2 sentences. The old lights were the conservatives of the day, proprietors, very scripted, and the new lights were free, much like Whitfield was. And it caused a great rift among, especially Presbyterian Congregational churches, the new lights and the old lights. Now, most of this area were the old lights. New Haven was famous for being an old light, but here and there were little drips and drops of new lights. And Philemon Robbins was considered one of the new lights. And that got him into a little bit of trouble. The phrase strenuous in defense of ministerial liberty, what that meant was he preached at a Baptist church in Wallingford. To preach in other than a Congregational church at the time was heresy indeed. So he went through at least 4 church trials because of what we would call his more liberal attitudes and practices. Now, what I find very, very interesting, the Consociation, which still exists, we still belong to it, we're putting up with it right now, 6 years since, anyway, don't get me going on it. Anyway, this church decided that they would support their minister to the hill, and they did. And they told the Consociation where to go. We like our minister, we're going to keep our minister. And despite these trials, he stayed here for 48 years. Wow. And that plaque in the back opened as a pastor greatly beloved by his people. Esteemed, respected, mild, peaceable, and a peacemaker. Now, the other thing with these trials, these are Christian people, and they got very, very, very nasty, unbelievably nasty. And they accused Philemon Robbins. Some of it was really petty, I mean very petty, for baptizing a baby in New Haven. He could baptize in Branford, but it was highly offensive to baptize a baby in New Haven. Preaching to the Baptists in Wallingford was horrible. He was charged with doing lectures without permission of the deacons, promoter of divisions. He admits separatists to communion. He preached outside the parish. He invited others into Branford to speak. He brought the controversial Whitfield and Davenport here. They claimed that he taught doctrinally that babies that had not been baptized were rotting in hell, that his critics were carnal and antichrist, publicly reviling other ministers as false prophets. The civil authorities were corrupt, and most of those things were wild, very unsubstantiated objections, but they became part of these trials that he came through. Yet, this church totally supported him. They voted to have him continue as our minister, and the church was thrown out of the Consociation for about 30 years, until 1760. And then after that, we became members in good standing once again, and haven't been except for one other time. But strenuous in defense of the gospel and earnest in promoting the great revival. I have a question for Skip.
Sure.
Okay. Jonathan Edwards, sometimes he's considered the beginner of the Great Awakening, but he had a revival in his church in Northampton, Massachusetts. Yes?
Yes,
Yes.
1730.
Yes. Now, was that, I'm under the impression that it was rather spontaneous. And what I mean by that is, with Billy Graham, if any of you have participated in a Billy Graham crusade, it is very, very, very heavily scripted. The same thing was true of Billy Sunday, Dwight L. Moody, and most of the other evangelists. Now, Benjamin Franklin called Whitefield the greatest orator you ever heard. To what extent were his crusades, rallies, meetings scripted, or were they entirely spontaneous? And the same thing with Edwards. Was it spontaneous or planned?
No.
No, what?
No, it wasn't spontaneous. Whitfield never used notes. But he never stayed in the same town twice. So that meant he could repeat the same sermon time after time after time. So what appeared to be spontaneous was in fact the product of many performances. Just like an actor can go out on the stage night after night after night, and it's not a different script every night, it's the same script, a different audience. And that audience is hearing it for the first time and they're moved, but he's not preaching it for the first time. Edwards was not the dynamic orator that Whitefield was, but he was brilliant and innovative in his own way. And that led to a sermon of his that I'll tell you about. We think about Edwards largely as a result of the most infamous sermon he ever preached. Can anyone tell me what that was? Yeah, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I'm the general editor of the works of Jonathan Edwards. We hate that sermon because that served to stereotype Edwards forever after as the hellfire and damnation preacher that rejoiced in the notion that babies were rotting in hell and all of these things. In fact, he was a brilliant philosopher who, earlier than any other ministers in colonial New England, read Newton and Locke, the so-called New Learning of the Enlightenment, before any of them did. And he adapted their writings to an inherited theology. And this is what great thinkers do. They take an inherited frame of thought, and then they bring the new learning to bear on it so that it appears in new clothing. And this is what he did with Locke and Newton and other writers in the Enlightenment. He has also been labeled by William James, among others, as America's first psychologist, because he turned the tables on conventional models of the self and the personality, which always had emphasized the primacy of the reason over the emotions. And the whole secret to life was to govern your life by your reason. And then only after reason comes to rational decisions do the emotions come in to say, gee, Skip, you're doing great. That's great. Good idea. You stick with that. And Edwards said, no, we're driven by our emotions. Therefore, for everything, he said, there's an emotional predisposition of love or hatred. And that which you are inclined to love, you find rationally appealing. That which you find hatred for, you find rationally inconclusive. and unpersuasive. You think you're being reasonable. In fact, you're at the mercy of these emotions. And that's how this guy was able to defend the Great Awakening, emphasizing emotions as it did, by creating a whole new psychology of it. Well, after the 1730 revivals, Edwards views Whitefield with some envy. And he looks at the success that Whitefield enjoyed, and he says, I think this is what he said to himself. I don't know because he never told me. But I think this is what he thought. He said, you know, I can't match this guy's delivery and his dramatic persona. But I am going to write the perfect awakening sermon. And I am going to scare the hell out of this congregation that I'm preaching to in Enfield. And so he puts together this sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which talks about reality from the perspective of the sinner who's damned and on his way to hell. He hardly moves. He's not a dramatic presenter, but he's a genius with words. And he describes the agonies of hell's torments and the tragedy of the damned so compellingly in psychologically convincing terms that he couldn't finish the sermon. People in the congregation started wailing and yelling, "What must I do to be saved? Is there a balm in Gilead?" He had to cut off the sermon. And they broke the congregation down into small groups. They're wailing, they're crying, they're terrified. And other ministers who were in attendance, along with Edwards, meet with the people in small groups. It was indeed the most compelling sermon. Not representative of his usual fare. It was not spontaneous. It was created. And it becomes the one colonial text that you see in every literature class in every high school in America, much to our regret.
And I heard an explanation of how it came to be that he was nailed famously for that sermon.
Okay. What was it?
Unitarians and Universalists, they wanted it. He preached it, there's no doubt about it, but they publicized it, so it was a thing that Unitarians and Universalists wanted to know. I don't know if there's any truth to that or not.
Never heard it before.
Well,
But anything's possible.
yeah. The other, I have a bunch of questions, but I think I will leave my questions and just we'll close this part of things with two quotes from Whitefield. One, I was honored today with having a few stones, dirt, rotten eggs, and pieces of dead cat thrown at me. And then the other one is a little more appropriate for what we're doing here today. And as Skip mentioned, he was quite close to Wesley. Wesley tells of a dream they had. In the dream, he was ushered to the gates of hell, and there he asked me, "Are there any Presbyterians here?" "Yes," came the answer. Then he asked, "Are there any Baptists, any Episcopalians, any Methodists?" The answer was yes each time. Much distressed, Wesley was then ushered to the gates of heaven, and there he asked the same question, and the answer was no. To this, Wesley asked, "Who then is inside?" And the answer came back, "There are only Christians here." Do you you have any questions for Skip or me or anyone? Yes.
I just wanted to, and I don't know if it's apocryphal, but I had read, and I don't know a lot about this, that Whitefield was pro-slavery and was encouraging, I think he had an orphanage in Georgia, and was encouraging Georgia to ramp up its slavery because he felt it was important for economic sustainability. Did that happen?
That's absolutely right. Whitfield and Edwards both owned slaves, which is a little... the fact that Edwards owned...
Filing and Robbins.
Yeah, it was not that uncommon, but it was unknown in the case of Edwards until a fellow I work with discovered a sales receipt for a slave named Venus that Edwards had purchased. In the case of Whitefield, he began an orphanage in Georgia. And he was never really corrupted by what seems to affect so many TV evangelists, sex and money. He had a very droll and exciting marriage. Did I lose it?
Yep. You just push a button. There's a button.
Okay.
No, it's
I don't need it. I'll talk a little louder. He creates this orphanage in Georgia, and he employs slaves as laborers on this plantation. So you're absolutely right. He also preached to the slaves, which was taboo in the South at this time. Masters did not want their slaves preached to because they might get ideas of freedom, of liberty, to stand fast in the liberty where Christ has made you free. And they discouraged it. Whitefield preached to the slaves, and so ironically he owns them, but was very popular with them, given the alternatives of the other masters in Georgia society. But it's absolutely true. There are a number of residential colleges at Yale named for old graduates. Virtually all of them owned slaves at one time or another. Probably the most abusive slaver in the history of Yale was Elihu Yale, who was a merchant. And this, I think the point of this is that it confirms how intertwined slavery and American history are, and how ironic it is that we celebrate American freedom, even as that freedom is created on the backs of unfree labor. And that imbalance is now being addressed and redressed in a number of works that are establishing the centrality of slavery to the American narrative. It's not just a narrative of freedom and revolution and republicanism and all happy Democrats with a small d. It's also a narrative of violence, of appropriation, not only of slaves, but also Native Americans, millions of whom lost their lives, and I do believe it was millions, primarily to diseases that they had no immunity to. This is as much a part of the American narrative as freedom and democracy. And it's only by holding both of these in a perspective that we can really have a sense of the meaning of American history in its fullness.
Thank you. On a completely different topic, although thank you for that education, and it is something we need to give name to, so thank you very much. But you used the phrase break out when you were talking about this awakening. Was it that dramatic? Was it a sort of swept the nation in that sort of dramatic fashion?
Yeah, I mean, Nathan Cole's experience was typical. Whitefield was a more familiar name in the British Empire at that time than anyone except King George III. He was universally known, and this lasts most intensely from 1740 to 45. Why does it stop in 1745? Because colonial America is at war, and they're at war with France. And so the war begins to dominate the narrative of concerns that Americans have. Whereas before, all they could talk about was Whitefield and are you for him or against him? Are you an old light or a new light? Now all they can talk about is France, the new Antichrist. France is Catholic. France is trying to take us over. So now in resisting France, we're also resisting Antichrist. And guess what? Maybe if we defeat Antichrist, it will inaugurate the millennium. And where will Christ return? Probably Boston.
Exactly.
As a Red Sox fan.
Did he come to Boston? My cousins are here from Boston. Did he come to Boston?
I think he had a question.
Yes.
Didn't the Puritans, at least in their earliest years, believe in predestination?
It wasn't just the early years.
Did they still believe in it at the time of the
Oh yeah, for sure.
Well, how do you get converted if the decision is already made in heaven?
Well, you raised the question which the theologians puzzled over constantly. On the one hand, God is sovereign, and that means everything that happens, God knows about and God foreordains. That's the sovereignty of God. On the other hand, you are responsible for the choices that you made, and so if you choose to reject the gospel, you're going to hell, and it's not God who's making you go to hell, it's the choices that you made. So the trick, and I guess it is a trick, is how do we hold these two in tension, in a dialectic? Human responsibility and divine sovereignty. And for 200 years, the Puritans were able to do this. At some point, that synthesis fractures. One wave goes off in an intellectual tradition that emphasizes human choice and human freedom, that rejects predestination. That's going to be your Unitarians, your Universalists, your deists. The other side is going to emphasize emotions, revivals. That's going to be your Methodists, your Baptists, your Presbyterians, and your New Light Congregationalists.
So with these revivals, what was the conversion? Converting to what then?
Converting to Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And in that regard, you can watch a Billy Graham crusade or two tapes today, and that's the conversion. Something they often call it regeneration.
This stuff that happened in 1730 is still very much alive and well today among what's called evangelicals, Pentecostals. It's in the very same tradition, but not so much Calvinists. So there were conversion is a choice. It wasn't of God's sovereign act.
Yes.
From a practical point of view, how did Whitefield make a living?
He would hold, you're dealing with preaching 4, 5, 6 times a week to thousands. He would have offerings. And the offerings were primarily intended for this orphanage in Georgia. It provided him a living, but he never took a lot of money. That's where I say there's a difference between what he was doing and, say, Jimmy Swaggart or TV evangelists today who are primarily interested in the dollars. He wasn't so much that interested in money. Sex was not a thrill, at least I know. What he was attracted to and attached to was fame. And that's a powerful incentive to achieve. And in some ways it transcends money, sex, and material things. To know that your legacy is going to outlive you. It's not going to outlive him as much as it does for some, because he never forms a denomination. There's no such thing as a Whitefield denomination. And I don't know how many of you had heard of Whitefield before today? Pretty, maybe a quarter. So that, it's not a legacy that, he's not a household name today, and anywhere near the same way he was in the colonial. part of that is that he refused to create a movement. The Wesley brothers create a movement, and so you do hear of the Methodists today, which they create.
Where is he buried?
Newburyport. And it's his last speaking tour in America, and he dies on tour. A canonical figure. There's a crypt in Newburyport. The story is that in the later stages of the French and Indian Wars, a contingent of colonial troops led by Colonel Benedict Arnold stop at that crypt, and they open it and they cut portions of his vestments and pin it to their uniforms as kind of a talisman that they thought would bring them success as they go into battle.
He's buried in the Presbyterian Church in Newburyport.
Yes, and his nose is preserved at Drew University, and I saw it. His nose.
His what? His nose? Yes.
You know what I think the significance of it is? Protestants like to make fun of Catholics for saints and relics and sacred objects. Protestants are just as vulnerable in their own way, and I think that's what we're seeing with this superstition.
Okay, I see two more, and then I'm
We have
watching
plenty of
the clock.
refreshments. Coffee. We have plenty of refreshments.
Yep.
Do you want to break?
Just do these two, and then we'll...
Well, there's the guy...
Yeah, was there a strong movement against Whitefield in terms of puritanical or Catholic or other religions?
Sure. I mean, that's what the old lights and new lights. Well, Wayne read one snippet. That, by the way, where he got stuff thrown at him, included feces. That was in London. That was primarily a British story more than an American story. The chief promoters of those riots that, he got stoned, and I'm talking about rocks, on some occasions. Many of these were actors in England because he railed against the theater even as he was so theatrical. And so they weren't going to the plays. They were going to his revivals instead. And so they start harassing him. The merchants are angry because he's not going to the stalls to buy the goodies. They're going to hear Whitefield preach. So they hate him. His own Anglican church hates him because he sounds for the world like an evangelical, and he's supposed to be promoting the Church of England, which is anything but evangelical at this point in time. So there's a lot of, and it's that clash that just makes him more compelling. It's kind of the band in Boston effect. The fact that there is such rejection makes him even more popular. And he reveled in it. People would criticize him and he'd say, I feel so sorry for these people. They just don't understand the truth of what I'm saying. I have compassion for them. And they're gritting their teeth, getting angrier and angrier, saying, you're a madman. And I don't want to hear this. There was a lot of controversy that surrounded him.
When did he come to the States?
He made 5 visits between 1740 and his death in 1770. And he was at his most controversial on the first trip. He mellowed a little bit with age and became kind of, not unlike Billy Graham, who was very controversial at the start. And then he becomes a little bit mellower as he gets older, and the same was true with Whitefield.
There's one other.
No, I'm fine. That helped my question.
Okay.
I think you're getting cut off.
Oh, someone, no, I don't want to cut anyone off.
Yeah, just quick, I don't know if you touched on this or if I missed it. I was just curious if you mentioned David Brainerd at all and where he would fall in, and because I know he was in the area, right, or Haddam area, and where he would fall in line with Whitefield's kind of thinking and preaching.
Oh, he was an admirer of Whitefield. close relationship with Jonathan Edwards. He became a missionary to the Indians.
Who's this?
David Brainerd.
Thank you.
He got kicked out of Yale because he said Tudor Whittlesley has no more grace than a chair. Unconverted ministry sort of thing. His descendants, every generation, petitioned the Yale Corporation to grant him a degree, and they refused. He dies relatively young of a fever, but he writes a memoir, and that memoir becomes literally the Bible for like 5 generations of missionaries. Find a Protestant missionary, and I'll show you a reader of David Brainerd.
So I hope you both will stay and we can have conversation over our coffee and sweets and savories.
Yes, and thank you all.